I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, welcoming you to the South Africa Winemaker special series. Across these 4 episodes, recorded in February 2023, we'll be exploring the modern South Africa scene in the company of 4 producers, reflecting the up-to-date realities of winemaking in the country, with guests chosen to reflect a range of locations, production scales, and philosophies. Undoubtedly the most up-to-date exploration of South African wine, available anywhere in podcast format. Subscribe to be alerted when new series episodes go live. We continue the series today in the company of Richard Kershaw, MW of Richard Kershaw Wines. We hear Richard's MW origin story before giving us a South Africa winemaking overview. We go deep into the Elgin region geography, take a geological deep dive, discuss apple production in Elgin and its influence on grape production, talk Richard Kershaw Wines sourcing policy, before closing on winemaking philosophy and cellar decisions. Enjoy.
So effectively, I started out life as a chef, and I'm originally from the UK, from the Sheffield, so the centre of the UK. My background was food, and I was interested in cooking, and therefore I took the chefing exams. I was not a particularly good student at school, so I didn't get a lot, and that pushed me down that path. But on that path, that discovery was wine, the service of wine, the understanding of wine, and obviously that fascinated me. But I didn't leave chefing until 2 years later, when I had a chance to join a wine company just at the bottom and work for a couple of places. Then I moved on and, in fact, had a chance to study my diploma at the time and even my Master of Wine. But I was still very young, foolish, angry, and full of nonsense. And therefore, I was never going to pass it, far too opinionated. And I thought, well, actually, maybe rather than run a wine shop, which I was in London, it was actually in the Hampstead region, part of London. I decided, well, why don't I go make wine? And I was 24 years old. I was still relatively young. And I headed over to California and did a bit of harvesting there. On the way, met a guy who said, why don't we, you should come to South Africa. Met another guy who said, no, actually, you should go to Chile. And I took the second option. So I ended up going to South Africa and Argentina for like 4-week stints for each, going to Chile, making wine there, coming back. And like all these things, stories always involve some form of love connection. And my connection came in South Africa, where during my 4-week stint, just doing a bit of research, I met a South African girl, and she came back to the UK, and we actually were in France together. I worked another harvest down in Bordeaux. Then went to Germany, a bit of harvest, and Hungary, and basically a lot of harvest and a lot of bumming around, doing that, having a lot of fun. But there was a time when somebody said, actually, probably a parent actually was like, well, what are you actually going to do? And so I ended up traveling to South Africa, and from 99, I arrived in 98 and started the harvest in 99 with Mulderbosch. And I had an opportunity, largely because the more eclectic genius, and he would, if he was listening to this, would say sort of just over the border of genius to completely demented, asked me my interview question, which was, am I any good at pool? Which I said I was something that I was actually particularly good at, which meant I obviously had a wasted youth. And that led me to being employed. And for 3 years, I was assistant winemaker before moving to another farm in Paarl, and then getting the job back at their sister farm, which is Kanu. And after a period of time, I actually became the group winemaker for both Kanu and Mulderbosch. And during that period of working as the group winemaker, I obviously gained a lot of life experience, but I decided to have another crack at the Master of Wine. And that was a really more instrumental approach, because the Master of Wine at that point was, I was a little more grown up, had a little more better thoughts, more cohesive thoughts, better perspective. And obviously I'd tried a lot of wines. And then I ended up passing that in 2011. And one of the things that cropped up during the Master of Wine course was the ability to taste. And tasting obviously is forms half the exam. But one of the challenges was not the the challenge was passing it. But more importantly, one of the challenges I was faced with was the fact that when we tasted these wines, we did papers of 12 and we did them blind. And when we tasted them blind, we actually used to decide, we used to look for an origin and a region. And I would sort of dig down into, if it was for me Burgundy, I would dig into Burgundy and all the various areas. The same with Australia, in the various, from Margaret River to Tasmania to the Port Phillip Basin and so on and so forth. But it always came from the mentors at the time prior to my passing. When I came to South Africa, I would dig deep as well. And they said, no, you don't need to worry about South Africa. South Africa is one of those areas where it's all very ubiquitous. There's all the wine, Chardonnay is kind of all the same. And besides, there's no particular regional style. And regionality was an issue that I had because I felt there was a regional style. And B, if we look at the fine wines of the world, all top wine regions have a regional emphasis, signature grapes or grapes. And that's something is, to me, what makes them stand up. It's what regions that don't have struggle. We know those struggles. We know those regions quite well. So for me, passing it in 2011 was a real opportunity to go it alone and actually prove what you could do with a grape variety in the right place, in the right sort of climate, and so on and so forth, to produce a regional style that was very particular to our region. Now, personally, I had an affinity with Elgin. That's where I am. And for those listening, Elgin is in about 70 or 80 kilometers from Cape Town. And it's in a region that is the coolest in South Africa. And what I decided, I wanted to show wines with a sense of place, and effectively moved here in 2012 to enable that, I suppose. That's
Yeah, great. I love it. Yeah, it's again always amazing to hear these stories told in kind of in one go like that. And the thing that's kind of got me going as well, hearing that story, is that I talk to a lot of regions when I'm putting together podcast series and kind of trying to put out there that, this idea that oftentimes the kind of marketing and the idea around a region, a country that's kind of living in people's heads is often like from 20 years ago, and I would imagine that, to get somebody to try a South African wine 20, 30 years ago, you had to kind of simplify it. It had to be often a price driven message or a simplicity driven message, and again, often I think a grape variety. So it was like, it was so that it was familiar. But I'm just fascinated by that idea that there's so many countries around the world which people think they're simple and they think they know it, but yeah, as you say, you had that fire in you to kind of really dig deeper with the project. So I think that's set us up perfectly to then talk about your project and how you then set out to show that regional characteristics.
Yeah. Well, basically what I'd done is, having traveled the world and gone to a number of different, most of the countries I've managed to visit over the past 30 years. And what was interesting was to try and get sort of an understanding of what they do, how they do it, and apply those sort of metrics to Elgin. And so Elgin was interesting because South Africa, and actually, if I can just have a slight aside here, but your point about South Africa was interesting because it has we have a slight mixed message here. We have incredible history going back to the 1600s, but our real history only started post the sanctions, apartheid, and everything like that, because we had poor material. We had a KWV, which was basically not just a cooperative, but a monopoly. So our actual real winemaking only started in 94. And during that first few years, we were the honeymoon darling of the world. Everybody wanted South African wine. The challenge was the winemaking thinking was a little bit behind the curve because obviously people hadn't had the exposure to the international markets that they could have had. So it's taken a long time for us to get to that point. And in a way, that's possibly why we didn't have, or rather why we had a mixed message on cultivars. We were trying still to establish that. So for me, what I was really looking for is looking at different wine regions. And in South Africa itself, it's important. Firstly, topography-wise, it's a very challenging region. That with regards to France, which has certain topographical features, they over a wide area, wide space. So as you travel from Burgundy to Bordeaux, it's about 600, 700 kilometers. And there's a slow, gradual change as you move out of Pinot and Chardonnay and eventually arrive at Cabernet. What happens here, though, is they're on a much more small dimension because we have the Atlantic Ocean, which is adding a cool factor. And obviously proximity to that will determine whether you can grow grapes. The further you move away, it's going to get warmer, hotter, and less affected by prevailing sea breezes. And then you've got the mountains, which is going to create another sort of topographical challenge in that what side you're on, how that affects you will all have an impact, and alongside the altitude as well. So Elgin is a 50 to 60 minute drive from Stellenbosch, but whilst they're planting Cabernet to great effect and Cabernet blends, we're only 60 minutes away and we're actually planting Pinot and Chardonnay. And to sort of embellish that, and I sort of look at that, we often talk about regions with regards to the Amaro-Winkler scale, something California does to great effect. And Stellenbosch is sort of region 4, whereas we're actually region 2. So we're quite different, and yet it's not a far drive. It's a 50-minute drive. And that has an impact because where we sit in Elgin is we actually have 1,502 degree days. That's our actual amounts, and that's in terms of Amaro-Winkler, that's the same as Mornington Peninsula, which is 1,496. And that means that we are very much firmly in that sort of Burgundian vein, although we are actually cooler now than Burgundy, and we have been for a while because obviously of climate change. We don't get we don't get the snow in the winter, but that's important because that means that we can achieve certain goals that you can't in other areas. So, for example, Chardonnay, being a light, delicate wine, can be linear, can have great acidity, and it can have enough phenolics that will allow it to age. Because what I'm trying to do here in South Africa, I want to make wines with a sense of place, but also I want them to age. I want them to complex with age. I want them to have certain polymerizations going on within that bottle. And you can only do that if you've got the acidity and the phenolic structure. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble. For whites, that is. Obviously, with reds, you have the tannins as well. And the color. So Elgin suited me because it's Chardonnay. We don't also need to manipulate it. We don't need to add acidity or whatever. And of course, being my own company, I don't need to put lots of enzymes in it to break it down or whatever. And I do all natural ferment as well. But the actual main thing is that Elgin is a cool climate. It's actually, as I say, region 2, but it's also we have quite a high amount of rainfall, about 1,050 mils or 1,100 mils. And to put that into perspective, that is Burgundy gets 650 and Bordeaux 900, and we get Paris and London and Seattle get less than we get. They're approaching 1,000. So those rainy cities don't actually get as much as we do. Now, clearly, we're getting a little more at winter, and we're getting slightly higher intensity of rain when it does precipitate. But that makes for an interesting dynamic because it gives us more nitrogen in the soil, which has certain impacts on our ability to grow grapes, and so on and so forth. So that's the one thing. We're also slightly altitude. We're about 300 to 500 meters above sea level. And for those looking at the map, we're actually right next to the Atlantic Ocean. We're no more than 4 kilometers up to about 20 kilometers. So we're getting the benefit of that in our region. So there's there's a dozen other metrics, but those are the most important. Actually, no, there's probably one more important metric which I would add is that Elgin's coolness is amplified because we have humidity. And, when you've spoken to perhaps people in Oregon and places like that, that higher humidity rather than the continentality effect makes your canopy a little bit more damp, a little bit more, actually they call it vapor pressure deficit, the amount of moisture around the canopy. That is having an impact on softening the way the fruit is. It's a slightly more complex, savory, restrained fruit. It's not that bright poppy fruit that you get, let's say, in a place like Chile, which has huge diurnal range, but has very low humidity, which means you're getting a very different style to the way the fruit is formed. And that's interesting because as climate change is starting to affect us, that is something I'm seeing more of, which is a good thing, obviously, in terms of fruit, and a bad thing in terms of rot. You will get more virulent pests and stuff, but that's you have to take both to make good wine.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, this is a real powerhouse episode already. I really love the depth of answers that you're giving, and really, I think I'm learning loads, and I'm sure everyone listening is learning loads as well. I think yeah, the idea really, Richard, that I'm left with from that description is really, just I'm curious to kind of unpick a little bit that. As you've kind of contrasted Elgin and Stellenbosch,
Yeah.
by no means sort of tying you into using those as a pair. But I think, it would be great to almost, as I describe it, kind of fly the drone up and kind of just maybe even on that journey, as you say, that kind of 50-minute drive, just I think sort of start to unpick. Again, it can be at a fairly high level. What might be some of the, I guess, topographical differences that we might see.
Yes.
That are kind of they're influencing those say marked differences in kind of, I guess, micro and kind of macro climate really in those regions.
Okay, so I think there's at least 2 points to raise here. Actually, I probably could have added them on, but I didn't. I'm concerned I go on too much. I do get criticized for that.
No worries.
But the thing with so the main criteria here is that the Stellenbosch region is facing towards the sea. There's an avenue, basically, topographically, you're on the Stellenbosch Mountain, Simmonsburg, and then you've got a little bit of the Devon Valley. But importantly, one of the prevailing winds, which is the southeaster, is an ameliorative wind. It doesn't tend to blow, it blows hard, and it gets to a certain stage. It usually gets to just beyond Stellenbosch, the town, and not that much further. But that will have an ameliorative effect. It isn't a cold wind. It is just something that stops the spike of heat as you're going up there. So that's important. But you've got to also remember it's a bright, sunny day. So that's what you're getting. In our region, we are surrounded by mountains, and I didn't emphasize that enough. That's my fault. But basically, the back of us, we're in like if you can imagine, a raised saucer. So we've got 4 passes, east, west, north, south. And to get into the area, you have to go over those passes. And the back part is the highest. It's about 1,500 meters above sea level. The front part is about 500. And the sides are obviously an average of both of those. And that has the effect that when we get the southeaster, the wind is coming in. And of course, the mountains create a buffer, and that creates cloud cover. So whilst we're getting the southeaster, we're getting a lot more cloud cover. And that cloud cover has 2 very important effects. Firstly, cloud cover will reduce temperature. Secondly, it could, under very strong circumstances, create rain, which is why we get extra rain in the summer, called a black southeaster. And thirdly, which is interesting, is it creates filtered sunlight. And the sunlight is important because, as we know, sunlight, or the UVA, which is the period between 10 and 2, tends to be the area where you're going to get all that sunlight coming into your canopy and your berries in particular. And there's a little thing called abscisic acid, which is a little vehicle which is actually programmed to tell the berries to push sugars into them, and that will create ripeness. It's basically when the sun is shining, you want to create as much sugars as possible. Whereas filtered sunlight won't allow that to happen. It also is a reason, therefore, we're getting phenolic ripeness but not sugar ripeness, which means that our alcohols are also correspondingly lower. But the second effect, or going back to just one step to the cloud cover, what we are finding is that we can be in a situation like in the middle of December. A classic example, I'm heading to the mall for Christmas shopping. It's a 25-kilometer journey. I'm not even going to Stellenbosch. I'm simply going over the mountain. And it can be 14.5 degrees and raining. And 25 kilometers later, as I've gone over the pass, it can be 28.5 and bright sunny skies. And that is incredibly short distance. It has an amazing effect. And we call it the lid. It kind of sits over us. I've got some lovely pictures of that, but it's basically how Elgin differentiates itself from the other side of the mountain. And that topographical nature is critical, the mountains. And for those visiting, it's what also makes the place so beautiful as well.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's such a vivid picture that you've painted there, and it almost I'm visualizing it, and it almost seems kind of otherworldly, really, because you've got, as you say, those natural barriers there and those passes, and it's I guess potentially also culturally it's all kind of happening, I guess, within that kind of container, and it sounds fascinating. And I think the element that I think will naturally lead us, of course, on towards talking about the grapes and talking about the wines, is actually to understand a little bit more the geology. So I guess potentially again, it sounds like a very unique formation there. Maybe to try to unpick some of the longer term forces really that have shaped that unique region, and then also what's that kind of left behind in terms of what's under the soil.
So certainly, obviously, we've got what they call the Hottentots Holland Mountain, which is at the back of us, and that's a slightly older Cape Fold Mountains, and effectively we've got smaller mountains at the front, which is hence why they're a bit lower. Mm-hmm. The geology basically is that if you're going back to the saucer shaped towards the peripheral edge, you're going to have higher areas, and that's going to be your Table Mountain sandstone. Mm-hmm. Those soils are 1 billion years old. And I just want to emphasize that, because when we talk of soil types, we are looking at massively old soils compared to a lot of, if you're looking at Europe or France, you're looking at 20 to 13, perhaps 50 million years old, unless there's rock screes of 10,000 years old. But effectively, you've got 1 billion years old soil. As you're coming towards the middle, further down, you've got a bit of granite, which is about 500 million years old, although Elgin doesn't have vast quantities of that, quite small and mixed, usually with a bit of quartz and some of the sandstone. And then the bulk of it is shale, and shale is what they call Bockerveld shale. And if you've interviewed some of my colleagues, they are on mostly Malmesbury shale further towards the west, especially in Swartland. We're more Bockerveld shale, which kind of goes also to the north, to the Co-Bockerveld, and that's basically a friable form of schist in the modern terminology, that modern thing. I mean, none of these are actually as they are. Geology is such a challenging area. We have a little bit of in the middle, we have some gravels, and we also have a little bit of loam, which is unusual because loam is something that's been already washed out of the system over the mountain. But we, just because of that basin shape, we do have a little bit of loam. But perhaps just before I explain it a little bit further, so for those listening, it is quite one important point that I failed to say, and we may come on to it, but let me say it now. Our region, we call Elgin a wine region, but in fact, it's a slight incorrection. It's actually an apple region, which happens to have some vines. Apples constitute 8,000 hectares, vines not even 800. So we're looking at not even 10% of the whole gamut of possible planting of arable. And therefore, when we come to the soil types, you will find we won't be planting on loam or any of those areas, because that's for the apples where they're wanting production. That we're planting on the more sort of challenging soils, which give us the lower yields, but also what we're really after. So we're mostly on shale soils and a little bit of sandstone, clearly depending on where you are. But the thing is with those soils, they are what I should also mention as well. Sorry, there's so many facets to string through. But I think the other thing with the geology is that for those familiar with the various ecosystems around the world, we have the sort of Eurasian, we have the North American, we have obviously the Amazonian. And these are large systems. Amazonian is smaller, but in our region, we've got the Cape Floral Kingdom. And in fact, that's quite a small little region. And for those familiar with it, it's proteas and rhinostobos and various other things that make up these fascinating little plants that grow on our hillsides and wherever. The large reason why they do is that they're on these decomposed soils, which have very low pHs, about 5.5. They can exist on these soils, whereas it's not as easy to exist on a slightly higher pH soil. That makes our region interesting because the soils themselves are incredibly old, as I've mentioned, and they are very friable. So the soils don't give easily to making, you can't just tunnel through a mountain like you can in Switzerland. These are very, very friable soils. So that's what makes it important, because they are relatively straightforward to dig, but they need to be ameliorated with a bit of lime, because we need to push the pH up. That's the one aspect. But it does make for something a little bit different to what I would say the more younger and fossilized soils that you get towards Europe, and we get them also towards the eastern part of where I make the eastern part of the Western Cape.
Okay, yeah, no, I love it. This is again, super interesting to take this deep dive. I haven't personally had the pleasure yet of going and visiting and touring around South Africa, and this is certainly the next best thing, getting this virtual tour of these different regions, and learning an absolute load. And I think it's also super interesting that you brought in about the apples and maybe even just the relatively that balance between apples and grapes being planted, and I presumably other crops as well, or are they the two that are sort of battling it out, apples versus grapes?
So interestingly enough, obviously before we go down the rabbit hole of apples, but basically apples, because we can. No, apples basically are an incredibly profitable cash crop here in Elgin, because we have, I listen, I'm not an expert on apples at all, but what I can say is that the apple industry has created a very interesting dynamic in Elgin. I'll get to that dynamic in a second, but basically, prior to the sort of 90s and during the 90s, there was a lot of orchards planted with the more familiar familiar apples that we see in our supermarkets. But they realized that they couldn't make money that way. So they planted a few vines. Then they started realizing that actually with the right apples, they could start to actually do really, really well. That then led them to plant the right apples or hybrids of them. And then they started to make a lot more money. And in fact, when I started making wines, not started, but sort of 2010, 2011, the actual profitability on apples were 8 times more than grapes as a cash crop, not obviously to put it into wine, but as a grape, 8 times more profitable. And at the time, the apples were some of the most profitable land in the Southern Hemisphere in terms of Elgin's growing apples, because they were selling the sort of, the fancier apples, which, when you go into the supermarket, instead of the bag of apples, it was the ones in the little 4-pack that you pay, a slightly higher price for. Those were where Elgin where Forte was. And in fact, it was a threat to grape production, because obviously at that chance, why would you plant more grapes? In fact, wouldn't it be more better? Wouldn't it be more better to actually simply plant more grapes? More apples. And that did start to happen. There was actually an uprooting from 800 to 750. But that then gives a dynamism and opportunity, as I mentioned just now, to the grape farmers. Firstly, to perhaps increase the price, increase the farming, increase the profitability of them. And that's what's kind of happened. So we've ended up in a situation that whilst here in 2023, grapes are still 3 times less profitable than apples, they are still profitable. And importantly, as I mentioned with the soils, they're planted on soils that the apples would be less profitable on regardless. But it does mean that we are the most expensive region to buy grapes per se. And it also means that we can't, or rather we have to be very careful as to what we choose to plant. Something that's going to not get a price, something that has a price ceiling, a grape variety that has a price ceiling will not benefit here, because you're not going to get the rate of return on investment that you would with a grape that has a better understanding. That hence we are planting more Pinot, more Chardonnay, but we don't have a lot of Chenin or anything like that, because it doesn't really make much sense at this point. So hope that explains a little bit.
Yeah, no, I love it, and I think that very naturally then leads into talking about, I guess, your sourcing policy there, and I think also then I didn't just have a question which I think can be answered alongside that, but it was where are those grapes going to? Is it a case of there are then to raise that profitability and to raise the viability, wineries kind of started to spring up in Elgin, or indeed are a lot of those prized Elgin grapes actually going out through the passes and going off into other regions where they're being vinified?
So there's 2 parts to that. The first, I will say, just to start us off on that, is that we're a virtual winery, and by virtual it means that we do have the opportunity to buy in and source grapes from a number of different growers around the Elgin region. At the same time, we don't have a winery, so I make use of 2 facilities in Elgin to make the wines. So that's an important facet. With part to the second part of the question, yes, obviously the quality of Elgin grapes means that there has been a movement towards more wineries being built, but from a low base. There are in the valley no more than a handful of wineries currently that are being built slowly and surely. But of course, most of the farms that plant grapes also plant apples. And therefore, it's always been a sort of side sector. And that means that most of the grapes tend to be sold outside of the Elgin region. And in fact, I can give you even numbers on that. It's 79% of all the fruit grown in Elgin is actually made or processed in another region. So it's a very small amount actually being held here. It has gone down, which is good. So at least we are keeping more of the fruit here. But that means that whilst it's a prized possession, not a lot of it is being made here. It's 20-25% maximum.
And so quick insert there. Yeah. So is that fruit getting its, origin recognized when it goes into those wines?
No. That's a great question, and that's actually a very important question. Was it in the past? I doubt. I think it was being blended into other blends. I know many years ago, people would look for the acidity that we get. The retention of acidity is high here, so that would be a nice sort of little dollop in the final wine to add acidity. But now, because of the price, it makes less sense to do that because clearly you are now adding a very expensive grape variety to something that's less expensive. So it makes sense to put Elgin on the label, and that definitely has happened, and we see a vast amount of Elgin-only wines being produced from outside the region by those wineries. Absolutely, yeah, that's definitely the direction it's going.
Okay, no, very cool, very cool. Okay, and then I say sort of jumped in there, but I believe you were going to talk about your sourcing policy and how that's looking in present day. Yeah.
Well. Yeah, no, definitely. So as I say, being a virtual winery means we have the option to source. And another little caveat here, just because there's always a caveat, but I do have my own land. I bought some land in 2004 when the prices were quite keen. But at this point, we haven't planted it. I suppose being a virtual winery, largely, and I was a previous winemaker, I don't have a nice big fortune to start putting up buildings and planting vines. Hopefully, we'll get some profits in soon, and then we'll manage to start accomplishing that. But at this point in time, in 2023, we are still buying in these grapes. And the advantage of that is you can be very selective. So what I have tended to do is largely through my own personal dialogue with what I've seen out there and what I've seen here is I've tended to select a lot of Dijon clones, the French clones, for both the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir. And the clones that I'm using are in the blend are all Dijon clones. We don't use any non-Dijon or ones that are created either here or in America. We are very, very solely interested in that. So that's the one thing I'm interested in the clone. And then obviously the site is clear. But given that the sites there's some good sites, we've already spoken about the soils, but we've got a good mix of gravels and shales and a bit of sandstone. So between those three, that's what makes up our main thing. And then within that, there are different areas. So most of the grapes we source either from the north part of Elgin it's the north, middle, and west. More recently, a little bit from the south, but that's kind of to me where the fun and games is happening in terms of what I'm looking for. There's a little higher rainfall there, it's a little cooler, slightly gets warmer as you're going further east, not much, but a little bit. But that's kind of the dynamics of the valley. But that's what I'm doing. I'm taking, as I say, different plots from those. What I will say on top of that, which is important, is I'm taking from parcels of, say, I'm taking 11 parcels, say, for example, for Chardonnay, but they are morcellated parcels. Within them, they will carry different clones, and we can talk about those in a moment. But those clones make up 21 batches because we are subdividing those morcellated parcels into each batch. So we have a single soil and a single clone that we can then ferment separately and use a little bit of an algorithm to match them to the type of barrel that I'm going to use. That's another facet, but that gives us the opportunity to really dive quite deeply into a little bit of a geek fest where we actually match the barrel choice to the soil and the clonal type, and that's an extra little thing that I enjoy doing. But I think hopefully to answer that question is we're using different clones and they're all Dijon clones: C195, C196, CY76, and CY548. None of them are very imaginative. I'm convinced that in Burgundy they all chose them at about 2:00 in the morning, sort of thinking, what should we call them? But those are they. So
love it. Yeah, that's great. And I think you naturally already perfectly started to lead us through into talking about the vinification. And if you wouldn't mind, I guess first just again maybe drawing up in the drone and giving us a sense of where are these grapes actually being vinified? What does the facility kind of look like present day?
Yeah. So How that works is we have one facility that I particularly do Chardonnay in. Largely because what I've done is so the one facility is a really, really smart winery just opposite to where I live. I'm very good friends with the owners, and it's more conducive to do barrel fermented Chardonnay, because bearing in mind all the Chardonnay I make is barrel fermented of some description. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But that's basically made there because I've got a press that I bought so that they could use that, and then everything else kind of follows on from that. So that works extremely well. And what I've done is I've invested quite heavily in the plant so that we could utilize that, and then they can utilize that in situ. The other winery, I've invested in sorting tables and a special what they call Rotaveb destemmer, which can sort as well as destem, and then various vibrating tables, and then a number of different tanks and so on and so forth. And that allows me to do my Pinot Noir and Syrah. And that's actually at another farm. I actually consult for them as well. So there's an opportunity to get involved with their winemaking. And that's about 15 minutes drive from where I am. So those are the two facilities that I'm primarily using. Very modern. The one was only built actually 3 years ago. So we're only in our fourth season. So still very young.
Very cool. And another thing that really stood out from the interview questionnaire that you sent across was talking about the I guess the philosophy really in the cellar, and I think there were some interesting points that you raised there, and just talking about the balance of importance between, of course, showing the origins and showing the sense of place, but then also recognizing that there were particular inputs and decisions that you were making in the cellar that you thought were worthy of note. So please take us into that area of the production.
So absolutely. The thing with the winemaking is that I very much, as I alluded to at the beginning, in terms of getting a sense of place, one is trying to look at what the grapes are going to deliver to us each year. And Elgin, being a cool climate, will deliver a vintage rather than a consistent sort of crop every year. Is always going to be vintage defined. So that makes it interesting for me as the winemaker and wanting to show or cajole that process along by watching it unfold. What I'm trying to avoid is a stylistic, to say, I want to make this style. I don't want to put my ego printed on the wine. I want to really take that away from that, and rather to focus on what the vintage is giving us. So we try and do as minimal as possible. So the grapes are coming in for the Chardonnay. I'm talking Chardonnay here primarily, but we can go through everything else. That's cool. They're handled basically. They actually come into the cellar. I actually got some coming in today. They're whole bunch pressed. I am not looking for juice recoveries which are really high. I'm a virtual wine. I want to just get a low phenolic index, so I want under 100, which gives me the ability to not find the wine later on. And then I'm putting it into a tank. We homogenize that tank, full solids, and the full solids go into those selected barrels, depending on that clone and the soil type. So that's basically how it works. It's a very simple process. And what we then do is allow that wine to ferment naturally. It usually takes 2 or 3 days to start. And we do very little to it apart from monitor it. And then what we do is we start a little bit of stirring later on. But more importantly is all of those batches are all going to do their own thing, all naturally. There's nothing else that we try and interfere with it. We don't try and interfere with it. But what we do is, as the winemaking comes to an end during, say, late April, and the wine is now finished, we will sulfur it up. We won't allow malolactic generally. There are some years more recently we have allowed it because it's been very high acidity. But what we do is we actually then taste the barrels. And this is an important part. For me, maturation is the second most important after viticulture. For me, winemaking is a more mechanical process. It's important, but the maturation is this cycle of 8 to 10 months in barrel. And what we do is we taste every single barrel every 8 weeks and make an assessment of that barrel through tasting, obviously, what we're tasting, and we give it a score. But we then decide what it needs to happen. Does it need a batonnage? We do different types of batonnage. We stir it, or we scrape along the bottom to create less oxygen ingress. And what we do is we sometimes rack them if there's a little bit too much reduction, or we may do something else, or we may do nothing at all, of course. That's important because we are monitoring that on a regular basis every 8 weeks, and we can actually see the direction that barrel is going. And importantly, we're not doing it on every barrel. So it's an individual one by one barrel. It's not just a sort of let's just do a batonnage because it's the 1st of April. It's done on a batch by batch basis. And that gives us really good definition into the wine. And because we've got a tasting note, I can even word cloud the tasting note, take those words up and see what batch that's going towards. You know, maybe more lemon and mineral or more peach, depending on the year. And that to me is useful just for my own guidance. And that helps us. And then by tasting it every 6 weeks, we can also analyze as we get closer to the 9-month period. We can start to taste if it's starting to go through something called manoprotein release, which is that enzymatic breakdown where the protein basically goes in an anaerobic atmosphere, releases an oil, it coats the protein and gives that lovely mouthfeel. And that is something, it's an enzymatic process. It takes about 9 months. And once we start picking that up, then we'll take it out of barrel to bottle it. Preferably not in harvest like we are doing, but generally we try and bottle it in January, late January. So yeah, that would be the ideal before we pick grapes.
A huge thanks to today's guest, Richard Kershaw, MW of Richard Kershaw Wines. Make sure you visit kershawwines.com, where you can learn more about Richard's project and find their main social media handles. Help to amplify this episode and the South Africa Winemaker series by sharing the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/507. And you can find links to all 4 episodes from the series in the description below. Of course, I'd love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, and at Wine Podcast on Twitter. Next time, in the 4th and final episode of the South Africa Winemaker series, in episode 508, I'll be speaking at long last with Angelo van Dijk of Yo El Rey Wines. Make sure you're subscribed to be alerted when that episode goes live. See you then.